In 1991, a 9-year-old boy volunteered for a magician's vanishing cabinet at a traveling circus and was never seen again. The police, eager to close a difficult case, accepted the convenient lie that he was a troubled kid caught up with a bad crowd. For 10 years, his brother lived with the suffocating guilt of letting him go alone. Then, a fortune-teller's confession led police to raid that same circus, where they found a custom-built wagon, and inside it, a large steel cage, locked from the outside. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The summer of 1991 arrived in rural St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, with a suffocating, wet heat that seemed to make the very air buzz. For 9-year-old Jamal Preston, the heat was just a backdrop to the electric, almost magical energy that had descended upon their small town. Marlowe's Menagerie of the Macabre, a traveling circus, had set up its faded, striped tents in a dusty field just off the highway. To most of the town's adults, it was a tired, slightly seedy spectacle, a relic from a bygone era. But to Jamal, whose world was fueled by imagination and wonder, it was a universe of impossible possibilities. He had begged his older brother, Leon, to go with him for its final night in town. Leon, at 16, was deep in the throes of teenage cynicism. He saw not magic, but chipped paint, worn-out costumes, and the weary, hollow eyes of the carnies. "It's cheap, Jamal," he'd said dismissively, lying on his bed with a music magazine fanned over his face. "It's creepy. I'm not going." "But the magician," Jamal pleaded, his eyes wide. "They say he can make a real person disappear." "It's a trick, man. It's always a trick," Leon grumbled. "Just go by yourself if you want. Don't bother me." Those words, casual, dismissive, annoyed, would become the ghost that haunted Leon's life for the next decade. Jamal went alone, his ticket money clutched tightly in his small, sweaty hand. The circus midway was a chaotic assault on the senses. The sickly sweet smell of spun sugar, the jarring clang of unwinnable carnival games, the low, mournful groan of a tired Ferris wheel. He bought a bag of popcorn and found a seat in the main tent. The show began. There were acrobats whose sequins had lost their shine, a sad-looking lion that barely acknowledged its trainer, and a clown whose painted smile seemed more like a grimace. But then, the ringmaster stepped into the center ring, and the entire tent seemed to fall under his spell. He was Mr. Silas Marlowe, a man in his mid-50s, tall and slender in a slightly frayed but still dramatic velvet coat. He had a showman's charisma, a voice that could boom with authority and drop to a conspiratorial whisper. But behind his captivating smile, there was a coldness in his eyes, a possessive, calculating quality that went unnoticed by most of the rapt audience. The finale of the show was the act Jamal had been waiting for, the Vanishing Cabinet of Calcutta. Marlowe presented a large, ornate wooden box, painted with exotic symbols. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls," he boomed, his voice echoing in the tent. "For my final illusion, I require a volunteer from our esteemed audience. A brave soul, a believer in the impossible." Jamal's hand shot into the air, waving frantically. He had never been on a stage before. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Marlowe's gaze swept the small crowd, and his eyes, cold and sharp, locked onto Jamal. A slow, strange smile spread across his face. "You, son," he declared, pointing a long, dramatic finger. "Come on up. Let's show these good people some real magic." His heart pounding, Jamal stumbled out of his seat and made his way to the center ring. The sawdust crunched under his sneakers. The lights were hot, blinding. Marlowe put a heavy, proprietary hand on his shoulder. "What's your name, young man?" "Jamal Preston, sir." "Well, Jamal Preston," Marlowe said, his voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper. "Are you ready to travel to a land of wonder, to step beyond the veil of reality?" Jamal, wide-eyed, could only nod. Marlowe opened the door of the cabinet. It was dark inside, smelling of old wood and something else, something faintly chemical. "Do not be afraid," Marlowe said, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "It's all part of the show." Jamal, placing his complete 9-year-old trust in the hands of the magician, stepped inside. The door swung shut, plunging him into absolute darkness. He heard Marlowe's voice outside, chanting nonsensical words. He felt a strange, almost imperceptible shift beneath his feet. The back of the cabinet, he would later realize, was not solid. It was a silent, spring-loaded panel that opened into another, even darker space. Before he could even process the sensation, a cloth, smelling of the same sharp chemical, was pressed over his face. His small body went limp. Outside, Marlowe made a final, grand gesture. He threw open the cabinet door. It was empty. The small crowd erupted in applause. They cheered for the brilliant illusion, for the magic of it all. Leon, miles away in his quiet bedroom, turned up the volume on his stereo, annoyed that his little brother was probably still out, dawdling on his way home. No one saw the small, limp form being quickly transferred from the hidden compartment behind the cabinet into a nondescript, reinforced wagon waiting just outside the back flap of the main tent. No one heard the heavy padlock click shut. The circus, its final trick performed, began to pack up its secrets. The vanishing of Jamal Preston was flawless. It was the perfect crime, committed in plain sight, to the sound of thunderous applause. The silence that followed the circus was a different kind of quiet. It was not the peaceful lull of a small Louisiana town settling into the night. It was a heavy, unnerving void where a child's laughter should have been. When midnight passed and Jamal had still not returned, the annoyance in the Preston household curdled into a cold, creeping fear. Leon, his earlier teenage cynicism now a knot of dread in his stomach, joined his frantic parents as they made the first call to the St. Landry Parish Sheriff's Department. The initial police response was marked by a frustrating, almost dismissive calm. An officer arrived, took a statement, and assured them that a 9-year-old boy, excited after a circus, had likely just wandered off with a friend or fallen asleep in a hidden spot. "He'll turn up by morning, folks," the officer said with a placating smile. "They almost always do." But morning came, and Jamal did not. The investigation, when it officially began the next day, was brief and superficial. The lead detective on the case, a jaded, old guard officer for the parish named Brody, arrived at the now nearly empty field where the circus had stood. Marlowe's menagerie was already in the process of dismantling, its colorful tents collapsing into drab piles of canvas, its mystique dissolving under the harsh morning sun. Detective Brody questioned Silas Marlowe. The ringmaster was a picture of cooperative concern. He was charming, articulate, his face a mask of sorrowful sympathy. He explained that the vanishing cabinet was a simple illusion and that Jamal had run off backstage during the applause, full of mischief. For Detective Brody, a man inclined to find the simplest, least troublesome explanation for cases originating from the black community, this was enough. He was faced with a choice: launch a complex, multi-state investigation into a transient circus troupe with no physical evidence of a crime, or find a local narrative that closed the file quickly. He chose the latter. 2 days later, he sat with the Preston family in their small living room. The hope that had sustained them for 48 hours was about to be brutally extinguished. The detective cleared his throat, his expression a mask of professional sympathy that didn't quite hide his disdain. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston," he began, "we've been doing some asking around. In the community, sometimes when a boy this age disappears, there are other factors involved." "What are you talking about?" Jamal's father demanded. The detective leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, poisonous tone. "Look, we've heard your son was hanging with a rough crowd from the city. Some older boys. This is all the markings of a drug deal gone bad or a debt they couldn't pay. They're probably just laying low until the heat is off. They'll turn up when they need money." The accusation was so monstrous, so completely divorced from the reality of their 9-year-old, magic-loving son, that the Prestons were stunned into silence. They were not just losing their son. They were now being forced to watch his character be assassinated by the very people sworn to find him. It was a classic, brutal tactic, When the truth is difficult, invent a convenient lie that blames the victim and absolves the system of responsibility. The official narrative was set. Jamal Preston was not a missing child. He was a juvenile delinquent, a product of a troubled community, caught up in a life of crime. The circus was a red herring. The real problem, the police implied, was right here in their own neighborhood. The circus was allowed to leave town the next day, taking its dark secret with it. The investigation was quietly closed. The minority struggles theme played out in its most insidious form. A black child's disappearance was explained away by inventing a criminal backstory for him. A lie easier for the system to manage than a complex abduction case involving a transient, hard-to-track group. For Leon, the guilt of letting his brother go alone was now compounded by a burning rage at the injustice that had just vilified his memory. The decade that followed Jamal's disappearance was a long, slow descent into a quiet hell for the Preston family. For Leon, the vibrant, often arrogant confidence of his 16-year-old self was extinguished, replaced by a hollow, gnawing guilt that became the silent engine of his life. He saw his brother's wide, trusting eyes in his dreams, heard his own dismissive, "just go by yourself," echoing in the quiet moments of the day. He finished high school, his grades slipping, his future as a promising athlete forgotten. He didn't go to college. Leaving his hometown felt like abandoning his post, a final betrayal of the brother he had failed to protect. He took a job at a local auto parts store, a place of routine and quiet manual labor, where he could lose himself in the familiar logic of inventory numbers and engine parts. His life shrank. He worked. He went home to the same house now heavy with his parents' silent grief, and he spent his nights engaged in a secret, obsessive quest. He had a map of the United States tacked to his bedroom wall, covered in pins and scraps of paper. He spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers from small towns across the South, searching for any mention of Marlowe's Menagerie or any other traveling circus with a vanishing cabinet act. He wrote letters, made calls, chasing a ghost. But the circus was a phantom, often changing its name, its route a twisting, unpredictable path through the forgotten backroads of rural America, always one step ahead of his desperate search. The disappearance destroyed his parents. His father retreated into a stoic, heartbroken silence, his health slowly failing. His mother found what solace she could in her church, her prayers for Jamal's return eventually softening into prayers for his soul. The joy had gone out of their home, replaced by a permanent, low-grade sorrow. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Jamal Preston was growing up in a cage. His world was a custom-built wagon, a rolling prison cell disguised as a nondescript transport vehicle. The interior was a grim, Spartan space. A small cot, a bucket for a toilet, a single bare light bulb control from the outside. The centerpiece was a large, reinforced steel cage, its door secured by a heavy padlock, to which only Silas Marlowe had the key. This was where Jamal spent most of an existence that could not be called a life. Marlowe was his captor, his provider, his entire universe. The ringmaster was a master of psychological manipulation. He didn't need to use constant physical brutality. His control was more insidious. He fed Jamal, kept him alive, but starved him of human contact, of sunlight, of any connection to the outside world. He would tell Jamal stories of the wicked world outside, a place of disease, chaos, and danger from which he, Marlowe, had rescued him. "You are special, Jamal," he would whisper through the bars of the cage, his voice a hypnotic poison. "You are pure. I am keeping you safe. You are my perfect specimen, a child's wonder, untouched by the ugliness." Jamal, abducted at 9, his mind pliable, his reality defined by his captor, had no reason to disbelieve him. His memories of his family, of his home, faded into a distant, dreamlike haze, like a story he had once read in a book. His world became the four walls of the wagon, the smell of sawdust and stale air, a stack of old books, and the face of Silas Marlowe. One of the few people who knew of Jamal's existence was Esmeralda, the circus's elderly fortune teller. A woman who had been with Marlowe for decades, She was trapped by a complex mixture of fear, dependency, and a twisted sense of loyalty. She saw Jamal occasionally, a fleeting glimpse of a pale face behind the bars when Marlowe would allow him a few moments of fresh air inside the locked wagon. Each sighting was a fresh stab of guilt in her conscience. She was a silent, terrified accomplice. As Jamal grew from a boy into a teenager, his presence became more difficult for Marlowe to manage. He was no longer the small, pliable child. He grew taller, stronger, and questions began to form in his mind. Moments of defiance were met with swift, cruel punishment. Days without food, long stretches of absolute darkness. He learned that compliance was survival. By 2001, Jamal was 19. He was a pale, gaunt young man with the haunted, fearful eyes of a caged animal. He had spent his entire adolescence in captivity, his only understanding of the world filtered through the lies of a monster. Esmeralda, now in her early 70s and her own health failing from a recent diagnosis, finally reached her breaking point. She had watched a child's life be stolen, had been a silent party to a monstrous crime for a decade. The weight of it had become too much to bear. She was also terrified of what would happen to Jamal when the increasingly erratic, aging Silas Marlowe died. Would Jamal simply be left to perish, locked in his cage in an abandoned wagon? The thought was a final, unbearable horror. During a stop in a small town in Florida, she quietly packed a small bag, slipped away from the circus grounds in the pre-dawn hours, and took a bus to the next major city. She was done. Her final act, she knew, had to be one of confession, whatever the cost to herself. The secret had festered for 10 years. It was time to let it out. The police station in Jacksonville, Florida, was a place of harsh fluorescent lights and institutional indifference. Esmeralda, now 71 and frail, her flamboyant fortune-teller's shawls replaced by a simple, worn-out coat, sat nervously on a hard plastic chair in the lobby. She had spent 2 days in the city, gathering her courage, her heart a frantic drum against her thin ribs. She was terrified of Silas Marlowe, of the long reach of his cruelty, but the fear of dying with Jamal's ghost on her conscience was now greater. When she finally approached the front desk, her voice was a trembling whisper. "I need to report a crime," she said. "A very old crime." She was eventually led to a small, cluttered office and introduced to Detective Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man in his late 40s, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being methodical, patient, and for having a keen eye for the truth behind a shaky story. He looked at the elderly, frightened woman sitting opposite him and prepared himself for a likely rambling, confused account. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" he asked gently. "My name is Esmeralda," she began, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "For 30 years, I worked for a man named Silas Marlowe. He runs a traveling circus, a small one. Marlowe's Menagerie of the Macabre, he calls it now. It used to have other names." She took a shaky breath. "He does terrible things. He collects things. Sometimes he collects people." Detective Thorne's expression remained neutral, but his attention sharpened. He leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean he collects people?" 10 years ago, she said, her voice dropping, "we were in a small town in Louisiana, St. Landry Parish. A little boy, a black boy, maybe 9 years old. His name was Jamal. Marlowe took him, used his magic act, a vanishing cabinet, made the boy disappear right on stage, and he never reappeared. He's kept him ever since." Thorne listened, his mind racing. A kidnapping. 10 years ago. The story was fantastical, almost unbelievable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still gentle, but now laced with a professional skepticism. "That's a very serious accusation. Do you have any proof of this?" "Proof?" Esmeralda laughed, a short, harsh, humorless sound. "My proof is the 10 years of sleepless nights I've had. My proof is the sight of that boy's face getting paler and sadder every year. My proof is the cage." "A cage?" Thorne echoed. "In a wagon," she explained, her words tumbling out now. "A special wagon, reinforced, no windows. There's a cage inside, bolted to the floor. That's where he keeps him. I don't know if he's still alive, detective. I haven't seen the boy myself in over a year. Marlowe, He's gotten more paranoid in his old age. But I know the wagon is still there. And I know where the circus is right now. She gave him a name of a small town in rural Alabama, a 2-day drive away. Thorne spent the next hour questioning her, probing for inconsistencies, for details. She described the vanishing cabinet, the hidden compartment, the wagon with the secret cage. She described Marlowe's obsessive, controlling nature, his twisted philosophy of preserving what he found beautiful. Her story, though incredible, was filled with a wealth of specific, verifiable details. And her fear, her profound, soul-deep guilt, was undeniably real. When she finished, Thorne knew he couldn't dismiss it. The potential horror of a child being held captive for a decade demanded action. He made Esmeralda a promise. He would look into it, and he would ensure she was protected. His first step was to run a search for missing children in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, from the summer of 1991. And there he was, Jamal Preston, age 9, vanished after attending a traveling circus. The case file was thin, the investigation closed, the official theory, suspected runaway with ties to juvenile delinquency. The ugly police lie was right there in black and white. Thorne's gut clenched. The old woman's story was lining up. His next call was to a number in the old file, a number for Jamal's family. It had been disconnected for years. But through property records and a bit of detective work, he found a new number for Jamal's older brother, Leon. Leon Preston, now 26 and working in an auto parts store in his hometown, was at home when the phone rang. He didn't recognize the Florida area code. "Am I speaking with Leon Preston?" a man's voice asked. "Who's asking?" Leon replied, his voice flat, cautious. "My name is Detective Marcus Thorne, with the Jacksonville Police Department. I'm calling you about your brother, Jamal." Leon's world, a quiet, gray landscape of guilt and resignation, suddenly, violently, stopped. He hadn't had a call about Jamal in almost 10 years. His heart began to pound, a painful, hopeful rhythm he had long since forgotten. "What about him?" he managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Mr. Preston," Thorne said, his voice careful, deliberate. "We have received a new lead in your brother's case. A witness has come forward. We have reason to believe that Jamal may not have run away in 1991. We believe he was abducted. And, Mr. Preston, there is a possibility, a slim one, but a possibility that he may still be alive." Leon sank into a chair, the phone pressed so tightly to his ear it hurt. Alive. The word was a foreign concept, a ghost from a language he no longer spoke. After 10 years of silence, a fortune teller's confession had just reignited a long-dead case and sent a desperate brother on a journey towards a truth more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The 2 days it took for Detective Marcus Thorne to coordinate with Alabama State Police and the local sheriff's department in the rural county where Marlowe's menagerie was currently camped felt like an eternity to Leon Preston. He drove from Louisiana to Alabama in a daze, a 26-year-old man propelled by a hope so fierce it was terrifying. For a decade, his brother had been a ghost, a memory. Now he was a possibility, a tangible person who might be just miles away, locked in a cage. The thought was a dizzying mix of elation and horror. Thorne met him at a small, dusty sheriff station that served as the makeshift command post. Thorne, a man whose calm demeanor belied a sharp, focused intensity, laid out the plan. "We're going in at dawn," he explained, pointing to a hand-drawn map of the circus layout provided by the informant. "Esmeralda? She says the wagon is here, at the back of the lot, away from the main tents. Looks like a standard equipment transport. Reinforced steel sides, no windows, single door with a heavy padlock. We go in hard and fast. If Jamal is in there, we can't give Marlowe any time to react." Leon just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The raid on Marlowe's menagerie began in the pre-dawn hours, under a sky the color of bruised plums. The damp, chilly Alabama air was a stark contrast to the suffocating Louisiana heat of Leon's memories. A convoy of state and local police cars rolled down the dirt track leading to the circus grounds, their headlights off, their movement silent. Leon was there, kept at a safe distance in the back of Detective Thorne's unmarked car, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The circus was a ghostly skeleton in the dim light. The main tent was a sagging beast, the smaller tents around it like sleeping animals. A few lights glowed feebly from trailers where the carnies slept. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay, animal musk, and fried food gone stale. The police swarmed the grounds with a practiced, silent efficiency. They surrounded the main trailers, their weapons drawn. A small, heavily armed tactical team, led by Detective Thorne, moved swiftly towards the back of the lot, towards the specific, nondescript wagon Esmeralda had described. It was there, just as she'd said. A large, gray transport wagon, its sides streaked with rust, its wheels sunk slightly into the soft earth. It looked like any other piece of equipment, unremarkable, forgettable. But the door was secured with a massive, industrial-grade padlock, a lock far too robust for a simple storage wagon. "This is it," Thorne said, his voice low and tense. He gestured to two officers carrying a hydraulic bolt cutter. The sound of the bolt cutter's jaws clamping down on the thick steel of the padlock was shockingly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. With a sharp crack, the lock snapped. Thorne took a deep breath, his hand on his weapon, and pulled open the heavy steel door. A wave of foul, stale air washed over them, the smell of a space that had been sealed for too long, the smell of human confinement. The interior of the wagon was dark. Thorne's powerful flashlight cut through the gloom. It was a prison. The walls were bare, the floor scarred. In the center of the space stood a large, reinforced steel cage, its bars thick, its construction brutal. It was bolted to the floor of the wagon, and its own smaller door was also secured with a heavy padlock, this one locked firmly from the outside. For a moment, everyone was silent, the sheer, calculated cruelty of the scene taking their breath away. Thorne moved his flashlight beam across the interior of the cage. It was mostly empty. A filthy mattress in one corner, a bucket in another, a few scattered, tattered books. And huddled on a mattress, his back to them, was a figure. It was a young man, thin and pale, his hair long and matted, his clothes little more than rags. He didn't move at the sound of the door opening, didn't react to the light. He just sat there, rocking slightly, a ghost in a steel cage. "Get those bolts cut," Thorne ordered, his voice tight. "Now!" The bolt cutters came again, this time for the padlock on the cage. The sound of the metal snapping echoed in the confined space. Thorne pushed open the cage door. He knelt. "Jamal," he said softly. "Jamal Preston?" The figure slowly, hesitantly, turned. His face was gaunt, his skin an unhealthy, almost translucent white from a decade without sun. But it was the eyes that were the most horrifying. They were wide, full of a deep, profound terror that had been his only companion for 10 years. It was the face of a 19-year-old boy, but the eyes were ancient, filled with a horror no one should ever have to witness, let alone endure. He stared at the uniformed men, at their guns, at their flashlights, as if they were creatures from another world. From the car, Leon watched as paramedics rushed a figure on a gurney out of the wagon, shielding him with blankets. He caught a glimpse of a pale face, of matted hair, of wide, terrified eyes. The 9-year-old boy he had lost was gone. In his place was this broken stranger, a ghost pulled from a 10-year nightmare. The relief he had hoped to feel was swallowed by a wave of grief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. They had found him. But what, he wondered, was truly left of his brother to find? Part 6. A brutal rescue and a tragic reunion, 2001 onwards. The arrest of Silas Marlowe was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. The charismatic showman, when faced with a dozen armed officers and the undeniable truth of the open cage in his wagon, offered no resistance. His theatrical charm vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. In the interrogation room, he was not a monster of raging impulse, but something far more chilling, a man utterly devoid of remorse, a collector discussing a prized possession that had been taken from him. He confessed, not with guilt, but with a sense of aggrieved pride. He spoke of Jamal as a perfect specimen of wonder, a child whose innocence he had sought to preserve from the corrupting influence of the world. He described the 10 years of captivity with a chilling detachment, detailing the psychological manipulation he used to control the boy, the lies he told him about a fallen world outside, the way he treated him as an object, a secret work of art that only he could appreciate. He showed no understanding that he had stolen a life. In his warped mind, he believed he had saved it. He was a true psychopath, his evil absolute and unrepentant. For Leon Preston, the legal proceedings against Marlowe were a distant, necessary noise. His entire world had contracted to a small, quiet room in a specialized care facility, where his brother, Jamal, was beginning the impossible journey back to reality. The reunion he had dreamed of for a decade was a heartbreaking, agonizing process. The 19-year-old young man, who was his brother, was a stranger. Jamal was terrified of open spaces, the sky a frightening, overwhelming concept after 10 years under a metal roof. The colors of the world were too bright, the sounds too loud. He barely spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper, his vocabulary a strange mix of the children's books Marlowe had given him and the ringmaster's own twisted, philosophical ramblings. He didn't remember Leon at first. He cowered from his touch, his eyes wide with the fear of a caged animal facing a new, unknown presence. Leon, his heart breaking with every visit, had to slowly, patiently reintroduce himself, not as the older brother Jamal had once known, but as a safe, steady anchor in a terrifying new world. He brought old family photos. He sat and read from the comic books Jamal had loved as a boy. He talked about their parents, who had both passed away during Jamal's captivity, a truth too heavy to share with him yet. He spoke of a life that should have been a life of birthdays, of holidays, of scraped knees and high school football games, a life that had been stolen not just from Jamal, but from their whole family. Slowly, painstakingly, flickers of the old Jamal began to emerge. A shared memory of a family fishing trip. A faint ghost of a smile when Leon hummed a song their mother used to sing. The first time Jamal picked up a pencil and, with a trembling hand, sketched a superhero from memory, a small, defiant act of a spirit that had not been entirely extinguished. The story of Jamal's captivity became a national sensation, highlighting the tragic ways in which missing black children were, and still are, often under-investigated, their cases too quickly dismissed, allowing predators like Silas Marlowe to operate in the shadows. Silas Marlowe was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping and abuse and sentenced to spend the rest of his unnatural life in a maximum security prison, where he died a few years later, unrepentant to the end. Legal justice was served, but the story ends not in a courtroom, but in that quiet room at the care facility a year after the rescue. Leon and Jamal are sitting by a window, looking out at a small, enclosed garden. Jamal, though still withdrawn, is no longer cowering. He is holding a sketchbook, the one Leon gave him, its pages now filled with his drawings. They're no longer just images of bars and darkness. They're trees, flowers, birds. Leon points to a bird hopping on the lawn. "That's a robin," he says softly. Jamal watches it for a long moment, then looks at his brother. His voice is still a whisper, but it is clear. "A robin," he repeats, as if learning the word for the first time. He picks up his pencil and begins to draw. Leon watches him, a mix of profound love and immeasurable sorrow in his heart. The victory was that his brother was alive, that he was free, but the brutal, inescapable tragedy was that the bright, wondrous 9-year-old boy who had walked into that circus tent was gone forever. He had rescued his brother's body from the cage, but the long, arduous journey of trying to rescue his soul had just begun.